I'm going to try one more time. Good evening. Woo! There we go. I've been so looking forward to coming, and it sounds like you have been too. I want to first thank Amanda Foreman for inviting me, along with Liz Rasmussen-Doyle, and the intern for House of Speakeasy, Martha, who I just met, who also went to Brearley, where I went from K through 12. So it's really a pleasure to be here. An honor, really, to speak among such other fantastic writers and scholars. But once I accepted the invitation, I immediately regretted it. I've had the most talkative year of my life. Really, I published a book, and I'm very fortunate to have been put on a fairly extensive book tour. And I also defended my doctorate, now Dr. Lewis. And I just accepted a job as a professor at Harvard. So I've been talking too much, clearly. And then I definitely regretted saying yes when I learned that the theme was summertime blues. Because as an academic, I never get the summertime blues. It's the best time of the academic year. I get to do the work that I love. I get to prepare for now teaching. But the question about why I never get the summertime blues started to stick with me. And I thought I would talk to you about what I learned in doing that. I'm going to do this one more time. What I started to consider was what the summertime blues represents for probably most of us, which is a sense of freedom, of possibility, but also what leads to that sense of the blues at the end of the summer, which is knowing that we need to go back to our workday routine. And I started to think about this tension between freedom and labor. So I want to tell you a story about what I learned about that and see if it might help us rethink our summers and what we do with our time. So to tell you about this story, I need to go back to an early summer of mine. I grew up in New York City here, and yes. And I would go every summer pretty much to pretty rural Virginia, where my mother's family lives and is from. And I was very excited about these trips because not only would I get to see my cousins, I am an only child, but I would get to see my grandfather. And my grandfather is the most free person in our family, you could say. He's a jazz musician, he's a painter, he has a name that seems to embody this sort of free coolness. His name was Shadrach Emanuel Lee. What a great name. He didn't love that name actually when he was young. The shortened version, Shad to Shaddy, led to all sorts of other epithets you can imagine children teased him with. But I loved my grandfather. And I loved going to their house, which looked like it was just about to kind of sink back into the earth, this white wooden sideboard house. Because with him, I learned to draw and to paint. I would sit on his lap, and we would inevitably end up drawing the figure. He loved showing me how to draw the figure. And I started to notice that whenever he would paint or draw the human form, the image was incredibly vivid. When he painted an image of my mother, he showed her brown complexion with all of the colors of the rainbow to create that beautiful tone. And I was so struck by this. I was a young child. I didn't yet know anything about contemporary art. I didn't know how wild and vivid it really could get. But I was stunned by his determination to show humanity with all of its full, vivid expression. I was also struck by how focused he was on this so-called free form of expression of being an artist. He was a man of few words, but he was very focused with that pursuit. I learned from him one of my first lessons about the relationship of freedom and labor. I learned that this beautiful alchemy of creativity requires the two, requires that we turn away from the sort of aimless freedom that tends to typify the arts and focus such that we can crystallize something into a sort of excellence. But when I asked my mother about the vividness of the human form in all of his work, she told me a story that made me understand why he was so focused for so much of the time with his art. She told me that he turned to the arts when he was in high school, the beginning of the 20th century, and had asked his teacher where African Americans were in the history books. And his teacher had told him that we had done nothing to merit inclusion. And for his repeated insistence on asking that question, he was expelled from high school. Exactly. Exactly. That's really what he thought as he considered his own family lineage. He was from Montserrat, one of the tiniest islands in the Caribbean. He saw his father, my great-grandfather, Enoch Lee, come to New York, be one of the men who built the railroad going from New York to Connecticut that I rode nearly every day to go to Yale to get my doctorate. He understood what the face of labor looked like in the United States, and he knew it with all of its multiracial, vivid tapestries. He understood that the homogeneous image he was being presented with in the history books was wrong. And so he decided to show that with his art and with his music and with his life. He certainly is not alone in using the arts to understand this. He certainly is not alone in being inspired on to creative heights through the adversity borne by the foundations of his own life. My grandfather inspired me to really consider this phenomenon more closely, and I was so inspired that I wrote an entire book about it, entitled The Rise. It looks at this phenomenon beyond the way in which it affects us regarding race, of course. It made me consider the feats of entrepreneurs and artists and athletes and inventors of all kinds to understand the improbable foundations of their iconic rises. It made me understand why, for example, a polar explorer, Ben Saunders, who I admire, could go to the North Pole and South Pole on foot, become the first person in the world to do that, and think to himself when he arrived at the North Pole about a report card he received, also in high school, that stated simply, "Ben lacks sufficient impetus to achieve anything worthwhile." I thought about Martin Luther King. I was stunned when I was curating at MoMA to go to Sotheby's one day in 2007, I believe, or 8, when Martin Luther King's papers were auctioned off there, and saw that when he was in seminary, when he received largely A's and B's, he received C's in 2 classes. Guess what class? Exactly, in public speaking, and then went on to lead the nation with the power of his spoken truth. I wonder what that teacher thought of Martin Luther King in the end, or what the teacher thought of my grandfather. Ultimately, these men and women I write about are able to affect out of their lives what Duke Ellington said about his music. He said, "I merely take the energy it takes to pout, and I write some blues." So I've spent a great deal of my creative energy understanding this dynamic and how our lives are enriched by people's ability to do precisely that. At the end of my grandfather's life, he passed away when I was in college, my mother gave me the contents of his will that were meant for me. And it was simply 2 items, really a set of oil pastels, dried out, really not able to be used, and a set of drawing paper that was yellowed and faded. The edges were torn. And in that moment, I understood what he was saying to me, that whenever we face sort of creative freedom or blankness, we are in lineage, whenever we look at freedom, we must understand that it's not simply free. From him, I understand just how much labor has been involved to allow me the freedom that I have now. And in the end, I think what I'm left with is an understanding that freedom is in fact just a disguise for a very soulful labor that, when enacted, can lead to a fully contributory life. Thank you.